Oh, there we go. Okay, thank you. Okay, so for today's flow, we will briefly introduce our research project and we will articulate on the findings of social justice pedagogical framework and learning outcomes. Then we'll end up with conclusions. So before we start, our research project are funded by the Faculty of Education and Human Development of the Beyond E-Learning grants and also the Anti-Epidemic Fund from the Hong Kong government. So the research objective is to first to identify how effective Nancy Fraser's social justice model can be applied in higher education context. Second, to investigate the role that student voice plays in social justice pedagogy and evaluate the social justice framework based on the experiences of students. Third, to develop a comprehensive social justice framework for students that can be implemented by individual educators. The key questions is that how or to what extent can Nancy Fraser's social justice model be implemented in higher education classroom context? Second, what role does student voice play in the applications of Fraser's framework? And how do students feel or what do they think about the role of participations in the planning of pedagogical context of courses? So let's introduce the Nancy Fraser's framework. As the most general meaning of justice is parity of participations. Justice requires social arrangements that permit all to participate as peers in social life. When the three dimensions act together, Fraser argues social justice can be achieved. So first, the economic distributions. It's called for redistributions of goods, meaning recognizing economic structure to ensure individuals can participate in the other two dimensions. Second is the political representations. It concerns chiefly with representations. It tells us who is included and who excluded from the circle of just distribution and reciprocal recognition. Third is the cultural recognition. It's concerned with the ensuring people can interact on terms of parity within institutions when they have requisite standing with peers. So the three-dimension framework presented here allows for multiple applications to different societal institutions. And Fraser's framework creates a space for all citizens to participate in justice dialogue. If the higher education institution is conceptualized as being a mixed society, and students and staff as citizens with the right to engage and participate in that society, Fraser's framework can be integrated in the model to achieve social justice in higher education. Although this model is not originally intended as a social justice framework for education, it does fit into the education context on a classroom level. Fraser's framework seeks to correct social injustice by addressing redistribution, misrecognition, and misrepresentation. The model presented here is to address same injustice, but in a high education classroom context. So first, for the economic dimensions, it is about student knowledge and experience as the good. Oh, you have to speak louder. It is about student knowledge and experience as the good being distributed to classroom or lecturer. It is about how distribution occurs in the student's context. And second, for the political dimensions, it is about student represent the groups and the groups
Can we check to see whether the participant can hear us well?
Yeah.
So we turn up the volume.
So for political representation, it's about students represent the group they belong to, and it's asked about what groups they are, what is included and excluded are determined by the students. Third is the cultural recognition. It is about how students in class are recognized as being important knowledge holders that can contribute to knowledge exchange. So next, so other than Fraser's framework, other justice consideration is for work. From according to Mills, under these conditions, work can lead to increased dignity when individuals can control their work, are trusted to complete tasks, and critically question things throughout projects. Second is procedural justice. Alexander and Rhythm claims procedural justice looks at justice perceptions based on the procedure used to make decisions. Third is contributive justice. Contributive justice is about the expectations and ability to contribute in one's work and the contribution in either quantity or quality made in the project. So we'll talk about the methodology that we used for the project. So we actually used a participation action research, which is so-called PAR. Since PAR purpose is to liberate people from their political struggle, so it is an appropriate means to apply the model to an higher education context. Using PAR can help move higher education institutions towards being more socially just through the students and educators working together to create individual course content that accurately reflect the students' lived experience. So in the class, the flow of the course structure is that first the students look at the general course outcomes in their small groups. Next, the lecturer will taught the lesson 1 to 5, then students taught lessons 6 to 8. Then they will, and based on the work they had done in their groups. And then back to section 9 to 13, the section will back to taught by the lecturer again. So all of that create an individualized course content. So the research project is 6 courses were involved in this research project, and with a total participants of 187. Each group was given a brief introduction to the project in the first class of each semester. The planning and teaching sections were not included in the assessment for the course, so students were free to refrain from participating if they wish without fear of academic consequences. Willing participants will form their small groups and begin to examine the silos or list of topics of inquiry. The student then follow the approximate format as outlined above. In figure 3, there was a small adjustment made in 2 of the classes. How the planning and teaching curve was fairly up to the students, and if they need any lecture as guide. At the end of the semester, students were asked if they would be willing to participate in an interview or join a focus group, although it was made clear that they were not required to do so. So after the written content was obtained, there were 13 interviews and 2 focus groups of 2 students in each. So interviews will last actually between 26 minutes to an hour and 70 minutes, with most last approximate an hour, and the focus group lasts between 1 hour and 5 minutes and between 1 hour 55 minutes. So meetings were held after each interviews and focus group to discuss the results and to identify any areas of interest that could be included in subsequent interviews and focus groups. And the grounded theory was used in the data collections and analysis process.
Thanks, Oliver. So today we're actually going to talk about 2 of the different groups of findings that we collected. I'm going to talk about the social justice pedagogical framework that came about through the implementation of Nancy Fraser's framework. And afterwards, Linnie will talk about the extra learning outcomes that occur throughout the project. So I think one of the main concerns, or not concerns, but considerations that we have to give when we're talking about the social justice pedagogical framework is that when we talk about the framework, so here's an example of all of the different elements that were included in the framework. When we talked to students and asked them how they understood these concepts and ideas, they tended to mesh them together quite a lot. So they didn't see sort of student freedom and equal opportunities as being so different from each other. So keep that in mind. The terms that they use are overlapping quite a bit, as we will see. So first, I'm going to start with the green column and discuss how students sort of viewed these concepts within the framework. So first is diversity. Now, diversity, when we generally think about diversity, it could be ethnic diversity, linguistic diversity. It comes in many forms. There was a little bit of that in the project, but most of the students thought about diversity in terms of diversity of ideas or diversity of opinions. And in this case, even when you go into a classroom and you assume from sort of the physical appearance of students that it's a homogeneous group, actually still diversity can play a huge role because everybody has different ways of thinking, different beliefs, different ideas, values, even if they appear to be homogeneous. So this was probably the most common type of diversity in our project. Student autonomy and freedom. So there were two kinds of freedom, the positive and negative, as outlined by Fromm. So negative freedom would be freedom from, and positive freedom would be freedom to. Most common was the positive type of freedom. So the students were quite concerned about having judgment, and so this was the most common form of negative freedom. The student identity. So identity are visible and invisible domains. It's really interesting because in student B, so we have a quote here from student B, this student is an ethnic minority student, and her group just assumed that Cantonese was not actually part of her identity. And in fact, it was. And there were other group members between but in fact she did, and it was quite nice to see that she was so willing to provide an inclusive environment for the mainland students in her group. So how they define social justice, it's very representative of John Dewey's definition. So a conjoint communicated experience. And this, again, it overlaps a lot with what we were saying before about freedom from. So it was social justice, democratic opportunities to express voice in the class, but also freedom from judgment. So the social justice had both a positive and negative aspect to it as well. And all of these sort of, I guess, ideas really resulted in students feeling an ownership of the course. So it wasn't just about ownership over the content, although they had ownership over the content, but it was also about students having ownership over how that content was being taught, because there was no restriction on what they wanted to do. They could do whatever they wanted. And it resulted in students sort of feeling in charge of the process. And I think also for student ownership, because it wasn't a graded assignment, they would only volunteer to participate if they were really interested in doing it. And it is important to note that there was actually, out of the 187 students who participated, the total student population that we had was 188. So there was only one person who decided not to do it. But generally speaking, the students were very enthusiastic and they felt ownership over the content and also over the teaching process. When they talked about equal opportunities, most of the time, they conceptualized equal opportunities as in equal opportunity to express their voice. So making sure that everybody had that space, making sure that one person wasn't dominating the conversation. And again, this idea of not being judged was really important for them. But equal opportunities, equals, that's that. But equal opportunities to express their student voice in the space. So all of these ideas really, if we talk about student voice, I guess this could be the overarching term that students wanted, appreciated, and really took advantage of and sort of ran with in this project. But there are two aspects of student voice. So the first is, of course, expressing yourself. And most often in literature, we think of student voice as being verbal, right? So if students are working in their small groups and they're having discussions, then they're going to be participating and expressing their student voice. But also within the class, you can also have these areas or spaces of student voice where students are talking. However, there's been there's been some research, I shouldn't say a lot, but there's been some research about the benefit and value of written student voice. So students who may be shy, students who don't feel comfortable in speaking out, students who are not able to speak out can write. So this can take many forms, whether it be on a chat box in Zoom, whether it be in Moodle for a discussion panel, whatever. But the other side of this is that you also have to listen, right? So you can't just constantly be talking and not listening to other people who are talking and expressing themselves. So you need to have both. Wade, I think what I like most about Wade's definition of student voice is that they distinguish between student voice and having choice. So, and having real choice. What is the difference between tokenistic choice and real choice? So I think a lot of times we do give students tokenistic choice, but it's not a real choice where they can really express themselves completely freely in whichever way they want. So here, again, we've got some quotes from students. Everyone's voice is being important. Again, we can reference the John Dewey definition of democracy here. And again, for student B, it's about not being judged. So it's important to have that negative freedom as well. If we go back, the student voice generally occurred in the discussions, both in their small group discussion and then also in the classroom discussion. It's really important what came about from the personal stories that were told by the students. We had students who were telling their groups about their battle with anorexia, for example, which is something that is so personal and I can imagine would be very difficult to talk about in a group of people. Specifically, keep in mind that this was all done over Zoom. So they didn't know each other, but having these small groups really allowed them to build meaningful relationships with one another, where they actually felt comfortable having these, sharing these really difficult stories with their classmates. And of course, facial expression. It's so funny because I think we all struggle with having students not turn on their cameras, right? So you're talking to a black screen. When students, but when students are in their small groups, it's not an issue. They will turn on their cameras with each other. There's no problem. So they can still have this face-to-face experience with their classmates and with their groups, and express themselves even if they don't do so in a classroom setting. It's very interesting. So in order for all of this to happen, there has to be a shift in the teacher-student power structure within the classroom. In Chinese, oh my God. Okay, someone help me with this. Can you pronounce this word for me, please? Tranli is generally the word used. I'm so sorry for my pronunciation. When we talk about power, but that term that's used implies an unequal power relationship. So it's a power over somebody, not a power with somebody. And the research by WONG stresses this idea of creating intertwined interactions as a way to overcome this power over situation that is experienced quite a lot by students in education. So we need to restructure the power relationship, and in order to do, and we can do that by shifting the knowledge transfer flow. So it's not just about the lecturer teaching the students. It's also about the students teaching the lecturer. It's also about the lecturer engaging with the resources. It's about the students engaging with the resources. So it becomes more of a dynamic classroom. And I think you would be surprised, because we ran this in 6 courses and there were not many people who chose to do the same thing or to do the same topic. Is really interesting. And even if they did, there were a couple of cases where they did do the same topic, but they approached it in such different ways. It really was valuable, even though there was no repeats in the teaching that occurred, which is very interesting. So student C talks about the distance, the power distance between lecturers and students. And again, this is maybe a cultural thing based on the research done by WONG. So students may feel more comfortable relating to other students, asking help from other students. And generally, I would say like the first maybe class or 2, right? There's still this sort of power structure. Mm-hmm. But I think after the second class, I think that they feel much more comfortable engaging with the lecturer and being on par with and being peers with the lecturer, as opposed to the lecturer having power over somebody or over them. So it's more of a power with the lecturer as opposed to a power over. If we go back again, sorry. So the power structure shifted because of the student-centered learning and because of the student-led learning facilitation and the activities that went along with it. But what we found was that the participation was so active. Everybody was involved. It was really great to see, and they were so enthusiastic about things. I mean, it was really wonderful. And the communication, again, keeping in mind that the communication occurred online. So students generally will struggle with the communication anyway, but the communication was really great. They used WeChat, they used WhatsApp, they used Zoom, they used whatever technology that everybody had access to in their groups, and they made sure that, as I said before, with the ethnic minority students, that everybody had the language ability to communicate properly and to express themselves and to ensure that their voice was being heard in their groups, even if that meant using another student to help translate, to make sure that everybody understood their perspective in the way that they wanted. Now, in order for the power structure to change, of course, the educator needs to step back. You know, we are not, we need to take a moment and to say, actually, I can facilitate these people in their learning and these students in their learning. I can act as a guide when they ask. You know, there were lots of times when they would, you know, students would come and just say, oh, can I have your opinion on this or that? Of course, you give them their, you know, your opinion, but it's their choice. It's their choice. And I think that having the project not be assessed really helped with the freedom that they felt in making their choices. So all of this together, this is really something. resulted in our students feeling a sense of empowerment. So one of the students was student H. She was working in her group with another group mate, and they had a pre-assigned sort of roles in what they were doing, which goes back to what Oliver said before about the procedural justice. So they made the decisions about what they were doing, and contributive justice. So they were able to decide amongst themselves who would contribute what to their learning facilitation. But student H went and made a suggestion to her group mates, and she felt like her group mate trusted her enough where, you know, they took on board the suggestion, and that made her feel powerful. And I think that that's probably, I mean, what more do you want from your students but to feel a sense of power in the classroom, and within their peer group and within the classroom environment. So,
thank you, Carla. Along with what Carla has said, students not only feel sense of empowerment, but also from other learning outcomes shared by the student. Here some of them. Just so in the figure here, like in terms the self-learning and critical thinking skill, knowledge generation, and cognitive development. Actually, it was really interesting when I was preparing the teaching material for other course. And a news article like from the BBC was they were surveyed about 5,000 knowledge workers, found that the majority workers do not want to go back the old way of work. Only 12% of them want to go back to the full-time office work. And then 72% of them want to have a hybrid remote office work style. And the article also indicated that some of the skills are really important during and after the pandemic, such like communication skills and human intelligence and critical thinking skill and creativity. So that is linked to what we are going to share in here, like some of the students share about their learning outcome. So let us look at some of them. For example, this process or this project promotes self-regulated learning, which recognize students' abilities and their strength in learning. And students as a knowledge constructor, they construct the meaning of learning, they involve in the learning process. And also some of the study indicate that self-regulated learning and improve academic results and also enhance learning motivation. So let us go to see other, like some of the students has shared their thought regarding the self-regulated learning. And instead to go through all the, instead of each quote, and I would like to emphasize some of the students, what they're saying in here. For example, student K, and they say, we learn a lot because she showed us that as the lecturer, how to learn from ourselves. So I think that one thing that good teachers are able to provide for their students, that I teach you, but does not mean that I had to teach you all the time. You had to teach yourself as well. I mean, you can learn on your own. That is part of the self-regulated learning. So, and also student B mentioned that it's not only suitable for like this course for this project, right? But some of the students also, we're not showing it here, mentioned that this kind of regulated learning or self-directed learning or promote the involving in the learning process also good for like primary school and secondary school. So let's go to the next one. Critical thinking, right? In the digital age, critical thinking skills are really critical and really important, particularly to avoid like echo chamber effect and other things. And in terms of the definition of critical thinking, there's not universal consent what is critical thinking. Here some highlight some of the points I really like. For example, multiple perspectives or balanced perspectives, and be not only criticize others or be able to see their perspectives, but be able to evaluate our own, I mean, we evaluate the outcomes of our own thoughts and our own thinking process critically, see whether we had bias, see whether we key assumptions had may have influenced our thoughts and thinkings. And then here's some of the quotes from the students. For example, student A mentioned that it helps me to criticize what I had learned before and what I had heard during their presentation. So that critical thinking helps students engage in the learning process, help me to make some internal link of my knowledge when we are going to have discussion which need critically thinking. It is a time for us to train our critical thinking abilities. So just like student A mentioned, is student G also mentioned that critical thinking skill, it had to practice, right? So we're really grateful to see that that is part of the outcome of the student learning process from this project. Let's go to the next. And they also mentioned about the knowledge generation. In terms of knowledge generation, I think online learning, like lack of face-to-face interaction, just like Carla and Olivia mentioned that online learning also be able to provide other, but at the same time, online learning provide other forms of for the student to have participation and have dialogue with their peers and with the lecturers. So those kind of dialogues stimulate thinking and just like critical thinking and also knowledge constructions. Here, some of the students mentioned that code.
Sorry.
In terms of knowledge generation, I really like what they have said. Is just like they had mentioned, and students create a learning community, just like teacher. They create a professional learning community, right? They not only learn from the lecturers, they're learning from their peers, and also the lecturers can learn from the students, and that is provide a knowledge generation. And also, student J mentioned that like when they prepare the lesson and choose a topic, they others can learn from them, and also they can learn from others, I mean from their peers. That create a lot of interaction among them. So another thing is just like the as I mentioned at the beginning about the self-regulated learning, it improves the academic result when the student can involve in their own learning process, and they are motivated and they have the ability to learn. So here's one of the students mentioned, that student J mentioned, that I'm really hoping that in the near future, here will be some change. This change in terms like the grading system, not only like the course provide a platform for them to learn, not only enhance their academically, but also because the culture-oriented, exam-oriented culture in Hong Kong, some of the students so focused on their grade. So they wondering whether that system can be changed, and then they may less focus on the grade and more focus on the learning and knowledge construction. And that is what they say in the. Another thing is about cognitive development. Cognitive development, I think, is really important in terms like in a learning process, not only like knowledge construction, but that knowledge construction can also through the interaction with peers, with the lecturers, can emphasize on the student development in terms of the skills and dispositions, and also to learn more about themselves and also the world around them. Just like the cognitive structures that are developed, helping students to make sense of their world and also to understand the complexities within. Here is some of the quotes from the student, and instead within all of them, and I just want to highlight the last one, student J, and mentioned that so that they would be also learn from us, then mean the other students or the lecturers, but we can also learn from them. Again, it emphasizes that learning directions is flowing from many directions. Instead, one like the spoon feeding mode in the past, like students sit there and waiting for the lecturer or the teacher to feed them the knowledge. And that's all my part. Thank you, Carla.
So at the end of this project, we do have a lot of recommendations, both from an institutional perspective and also for individual lecturers. So what we picked three that have three recommendations for individual lecturers, because this is something that we can all really apply in our classes. So the first is that we have to be open to new knowledge generation. You know, our students, just because they don't have letters behind their names, doesn't mean that they're not valuable knowledge holders, and they have to be respected as such, right? We can learn, they can contribute to their education. They just need to have a lecturer who is open to allowing them to do that. And we can actually learn a lot from our students as well. So recommendation number one, be open to new kinds of knowledge generation from students. Recommendation number two, we have to look at the meaning of learning. You know, we need to look at what is valuable learning, what kind of sources are sort of the most valuable, I suppose. Because usually what we'll say is, okay, if it's peer-reviewed article, right, then it's valuable and we can learn something from that. But students can also be valuable tools of learning, both from the lecturer's perspective and also from their peers' perspective. Recommendation number three is that we need to really look at the purpose of education. What is going on? Why are we here? And what are we trying to do? There's a really great quote from Michael Sandel, which I absolutely love. But he talks about the ideal of education as being the pursuit of truth, the promotion of scholarly and scientific excellence, the advancement of humane teaching and learning, and the cultivation of civic virtue. So I think that really what we need to ask ourselves is, are these ideals reflected in our practice? And if the answer is no, then how can we change it to make sure that these ideals are at least resembling our practice? So those are three recommendations that we've come up with for individual lecturers. In conclusion, when you take Nancy Fraser's framework and you apply it to education, and you conceptualize distribution as being distribution of knowledge, recognition, and then representation, they are so easily included and implemented in the classroom. However, applying that framework to an educational context does include a lot of other elements within the social justice framework. So when you're talking about student voice, student ownership, freedom, all of these things have to, or play a part in making up this social justice framework. You know, the learning outcomes are twofold. The silos of the courses were met because the students could not just go and do whatever they wanted when they were planning. They looked at the silos for that particular course. They looked at what was being covered by the lecturer, and then they came up with topics that would meet the silos of that course and that were not already being covered, right, by the lecturer. So the silos are going to be met. That's not an issue. The other learning outcomes are the unintentional learning outcomes, or the byproducts of the framework, which is what Linnie was talking about. When you talk about knowledge generation, you talk about practicing critical thinking and cognitive development. And the learning outcomes might not be course specific, but they are important to our university because they meet the PILOs, not all of the PILOs, but they do meet quite a few of the PILOs that have been outlined by the university that are included in the ethos of the university to nurture our students and prepare them for the future. I think that's it. Thank you everybody for listening. I really appreciate it. Oh, this is not working anymore. That's amazing. Oh, here. Okay, sorry. I was so good until the very end. Anyway, thank you guys so much. if you have questions or anything, you can either just unmute your mic or you can type in the chats.